to another episode of Solidarity Live. I'm extremely excited about the show today. We are going to be joined by just an amazing guest and facing this bleak winter that's coming up and looking at the numbers of COVID cases and hospitalizations right now. I am going to take joy in the fact that this show is going to be really fantastic. And Jocelyn, thank you so much for making the show happen with me. So why don't you go ahead and introduce our amazing guest?
Oh my goodness. It's hard to stay chill when you're introducing your childhood hero. But today we will be speaking to one of the most fascinating people I've ever encountered intellectually, the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant, Doctor to the Poor, Dr. Paul Farmer, here to discuss his newest book. How are you, Dr. Farmer?
Well, I'm very buoyed by that introduction. I'm great.
I'm so glad.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
So, your recent book coming out in the middle of a pandemic about another pandemic, it's not exactly a cheery topic, Ebola. So I read it in like 2 days. It's very long. I'm going to do a little Vanna White moment here. Everybody, good? But the thing about it is this is yet another pandemic that was subject to complete sensationalization, which made it very difficult for you and your team to fight it effectively. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. First of all, really thank you deeply for reading it. You're right. It's a bit of a downer. Although I'm thinking maybe I could do something like Ebola, the musical, but because
we would love to help with that.
There was, one thing that I worry doesn't come through in the book are the joys and satisfactions of that kind of work, of seeing people survive and recover, of rebuilding their lives, and of course, of being able to take care of them through those difficult moments. So I worry that I didn't really capture that as well. But like you said, this occurred, as so often is the case, in a context of deep mistrust of authority, of public health authorities. And, this was not new to me after 35 years of working in urban United States, in Navajo Nation, and Haiti, of course, and Rwanda, even Siberia. You just run into this again and again, the epidemic of mistrust. So it's important to point out that mistrust has a cure, but it's not like lecturing and hectoring the natives. It's not, or even trying to be their teacher about the nature of RNA viruses that spring from some unknown natural host into the human species. It's about providing services and, to the point of this show, about providing a security net. And since there isn't one or wasn't one there, it's about building or weaving a security net. And we were lucky enough to be involved in that and are still involved in that in West Africa. So that lends a certain optimism in considering COVID-19, because again, all of this discussion of mistrust and vaccine hesitancy is well known to people who labor in these trenches.
Well,
do you labor in a trench? Fighting in the trenches.
Sorry, Alex, I just interrupted you.
Go ahead, Jocelyn.
So, Dr. Farmer, I want to that point, so you're an anthropologist, and one of the things that you really influenced with my thinking about these things is there's this intellectual desire to examine cultures, like in the Ebola case. Oh, were people eating monkeys? What a sensational idea. But the reality, as you trace very explicitly, is that this pandemic runs along the lines of conflict and class warfare and medical deserts and people who were absolutely exploited. This is not about some social thing. This is about class violence.
That's right. And when you're a card-carrying anthropologist, culture is kind of the default mode of explanation. That doesn't mean it's correct, right? Everybody has culture. And culture influences experience. Of course, all experience influences understandings. But during the worst weeks and months of the epidemic of Ebola, we didn't focus on people's culture. We focused on the material privations that they had endured. Like you said, call it class warfare, call it extractive colonialism and its successor regimes. That's what left them in the clinical desert, not their culture. Although like every anthropologist and like many people, I'm interested in the culture. It was really after things died down that I got to explore that more fully, to my own great satisfaction. But I don't believe that when nurses and doctors go in to respond to a healthcare crisis, that they're suddenly be called to be amateur anthropologists. That often leads to more problems than it creates.
So I want to sort of dig into something that you said that I think is it's just a through line in all of your work, and something that we talk, that what you do to combat misinformation and pandemics and the fear and the anxiety, either Ebola or COVID, is actually, it's solidarity.
That's right.
It's actually understanding that the only way that you're going to get people to, quote unquote, do the right thing is to make it attractive to them, to make it obvious to them. And in the case of a disease, that means providing care. You don't go in there to try to solve things in an intellectual way or argue, or, but you really make it clear that what happens if you get sick is that you get taken care of and get better. And that is the sort of core of addressing a pandemic. And I don't know if I can totally grasp the level of failure of the US with COVID, but I do think it has something to do with that. Like, you definitely have a president, Donald Trump, who spread misinformation on Ebola and on COVID, right? And he's like the anti-public health president. But you also have a system that doesn't seem to fully prioritize just making sure people know that if they get sick, they get care and will get better. And that makes the job of addressing a pandemic so much harder. Can you just sort of speak to that nature of what you saw in Ebola?
Sure, although I'm getting a little bit of a chill because it's so nice to hear it stated clearly. We learned early on, the we here being Partners in Health, which, is mostly Haitians and Rwandans, et cetera, et cetera. We learned early on that solidarity was the most prized of human sentiments. But if it's not pragmatic solidarity, if it's not linked to efforts to serve and repair and think in reparative terms, you can be in solidarity from far away without any material impact. But the real thing that's needed in the middle of a crisis like either of these, Ebola or COVID, is pragmatic solidarity. It needs to be linked to pragmatic services to save lives and prevent suffering. And if you look at what's going on in the United States, as you said, not only do we have science deniers and anti-public health people in high positions, we also have a terribly shredded or security net. So the options for pragmatic solidarity are limited. For example, if someone loses their job but can't get unemployment insurance, if someone's about to be evicted and no one steps in to prevent that, that's the pragmatic solidarity that you're talking about and that we're talking about too.
Well, and so for those who haven't had the privilege of reading Dr. Paul Farmer's books, first of all, do that, starting with the most recent one. But I want to talk a little bit about what it was like to read your books so young, because I think it's important to this conversation. Like a lot of young kids who grew up in economic anxiety, I already had an activist streak. But I found a lot of the writing I would read would stop at a certain point. Be like, let's build a school. Let's volunteer. Let's do this one thing. But the thing about the medical work you do that's consistent, and that I think all the medical work all of us should be doing, I know one of your favorite quotes is that the physicians are the natural attorneys for the poor, is that instead of just fixing a problem, we should be questioning the systems that created these problems in the first place. There is no first and third world. There is no inner city and uptown. These are the same places. And we really need to be questioning why some people are dying of preventable diseases while other people are recovering. And you outline that in this book, that very few Europeans or Americans died of Ebola. And we just sort of that feels normal to us. How do you deal with people who that feels normal for?
Well, I mean, there are lots of ways to do that, to make that outrage abnormal, objectionable, outrageous, right? And I put limited effort into like arguing all the time or trying to win a debate. One of the ways that we've done it at Partners in Health, and that I encourage my trainees and students at Harvard to consider, is the pragmatic solidarity part, because that requires lots of people working together. So one of the things we learned to do decades ago in Haiti is bring the people most afflicted into the work itself. So a lot of my patients from the 80s and 90s who had AIDS in the United States or Haiti, particularly Haiti, where I, just larger patient numbers, are my coworkers today. Now, they wouldn't be coworkers, back to Alex's point, if they hadn't received antiretroviral therapy, right? That's the pragmatic solidarity part. But they also want to be active participants in the struggle for solidarity. And, whether you call it structural violence or something else, in the struggle against the unjust structures of their society, which, as you point out, Jocelyn, is our society too. So that's one way. Bring in people who have direct experience. In the Ebola epidemic, that meant not only caring for and bringing people through their illness to survival, but recruiting them as members of the team. Mm-hmm. Another way, of course, is through, teaching. I my day job, as I said earlier, is as a Harvard medical professor, but I also teach with the blessing of my superiors at Harvard in Rwanda, Haiti. Formal teaching where you have people in these places, or informal degree programs. Which, by the way, that was brought up to me when I was in my 20s. We want certificates, diplomas, degrees. I just poo-pooed it. I thought, well, that's not my job. But it did become my job. So that's a second way. And, a third way is to find fellow progressives who are willing to echo and amplify the message in conversations like the one we're having now. As Alex said, although this may have been off air, all of us are called to be thoughtful about policies. Some are very noxious, and some are very protective, right? Health insurance schemes on. If you look at legislation in the early years of the AIDS epidemic, the majority of it was punitive, right? So how do you undo punitive rules and identify better ones, or the kind that we would all favor? So I think there's lots of ways to change people's minds about things that would sound exotic, like case fatality rate. Among those affected, who lives and who dies, that's an important thing for a broader public to understand. With Ebola, the argument was, this is an inevitably lethal disease, don't waste your time. We knew that was false, right? It's never a waste of time or a fool's errand to try and save lives imperiled by any infectious pathogen, right? We knew that was false, but we also knew we needed a broader audience to understand why it was that white people from the United States were not dying of Ebola. It wasn't because of their culture. It was because they were airlifted out of the clinical desert back to places like Emory or Bethesda, the NIH, or Omaha, Nebraska, back out of the clinical desert. And it wasn't about their culture or their strange customs or fetishes. Those are the standard colonial explanations, by the way, as you know.
So I have a sort of, it's a big picture question, but we can sort of take it in a bunch of different ways. You're going to get a bunch of pharma hate from me right now, though. So let me just, that's where
Be warned.
Yeah. I was recently fact-checked on Facebook, which is a big venue for us getting the truth out about things. And we put up a true statement that said, taxpayers, the US people, paid for 100% of what is called the Moderna vaccine. And it's actually all our vaccine. And, you know, I say it's a people's vaccine, and therefore we need to make sure that this is available to everyone around the world. We got fact checked and by non-experts who were arguing they didn't understand that the university that were involved were paid by taxpayer grants to do the research. And then they ended up having to be, so I was like, okay, the only non-government money, taxpayer money, is Dolly Parton's $1 million donation. So like we're 99.96% correct. And you rated us partly false. I don't want to go too much into what that means, but just so you understand, it has a real effect. When it's rated partly false, our entire page gets squashed. We don't reach as many people. And it has a real impact. This true statement is rated partly false. So we argued with them. People way smarter than me were like, no, you're wrong. And they ended up saying needs context. And I'm like, why does it need context? We paid for all that. And then the same thing happened again to another colleague and ally in this fight. And it seems like it's really important to these corporations to not let it get out there just how much the research, the development, the whole thing rests on public resources, not private companies. They're selling this narrative. And what I want to sort of ask you about is the end part of it, because I see what's coming as massive shortages of vaccines that we've never seen before. And they're going to be distributed based on where they can maximize profits. And so if we allow the story to get out there that it's the Moderna vaccine and not the people's vaccine, I'm fine calling it the Dolly Parton vaccine, just not the company, because they didn't do it. And if we let it seem like these companies are doing it, then they're going to get to direct who gets these vaccines. And that's my big worry about where we're headed right now.
Well, I mean, just to, what's the word in the press, you know, a heads up. I have a number of proteges, former trainees and friends who worked on that vaccine and many others. And they're academics, you know, they're not, that's, you know, they're Harvard faculty or those are circles that I'm more familiar with. But what the point that you're making, it was true throughout the AIDS era and in Ebola as well. The new vaccine, I'll just start with Ebola, the new vaccine, there were more than one, but the vaccines, the diagnostics, and the therapeutics, which really didn't get a big enough trial, were all developed either in part or in large part with public monies. Not always American money. I think some of these were Canadian products. And it's, you know, it's very true looking back at AIDS as well, right? The big fights we had, you're familiar with them, I know. The big fights we had around some of the first effective ARVs were really along these lines as well. And as you know, the only way that this logjam was freed or the bottleneck opened was through generic production, a lot of it done in India, which allowed us to get probably 16, 17 million people, most of them on the continent of Africa, on therapy for life. So I do think that these arguments are inevitable, and they're born out of the fact that we again take public goods and make them into private profit. And you know, I understand there are many settings in which that might be a good idea, and I know the claims that it helps boost up R&D, but as you also know, a lot of that money really goes into something else, advertising, and an attempt to, you know, increase profits more. I would like to add one thing, and it's maybe related to my proximity to some of the folks at Moderna or who work with Moderna on the vaccine, is there's an enormous amount of scientific excitement about that one because it's an entirely new kind of vaccine. And so I'm torn between your, in my view, correct analysis and real joy at seeing something altogether new.
So let me, Jocelyn, just follow up on that. Sometimes in my like hitting on pharmaceutical corporations, some people take away that I don't have this. This is magic. It's the same thing as the antiretrovirals, right? Like these are magical things that we created by all working together in solidarity. And the only thing that I see is wrong is that last step that these resources, I mean, I'm just restating what you said, but the Dolly Parton vaccine, to me, it could lead to whole other chapters of medical innovation that we don't know about now. And what I want is for that to be driven by public health, not private bottom line profits, because it is ours. Companies literally can't do anything without the support of the people. So the people have to be able to then direct where the return on this public investment goes. So I'm just like vociferously agreeing with you, and also saying like the thing that gets me outraged is actually that this stuff is so powerful and we could create so much more if we actually changed the system to be looking at, like, look at what we did when the whole system was looking at COVID. Look how fast we did.
It was incredible. Yeah.
Right? Imagine if the whole system was always looking at solving the greatest public health challenges of the time, and not at increasing the bottom line.
You know, just to underscore your point, you know, in the Ebola book, I use the term Ebolanomics, which I purloined from a New Yorker writer, and he makes the argument that you know, if a disease primarily affects poor people, and in relatively limited numbers, it's a sure way to see these novel methodologies underdeveloped. And so, you know, the drug called ZMapp, which is really it's a monoclonal antibody cocktail, and the vaccine itself, or one of them, they sat on the shelf for 10 years,
Yep.
right? Because there was no market. And that is not the way to think about threats to public health, as you're saying. And, you know, so we're not dealing with Ebolanomics now. I mean, the scale of a pandemic assures that. But we're still dealing with the pathologies about how we bring these to market and that last step.
Well, and I want to, you know, obviously there's much to be angry about, but I do want to bring up the point you made earlier about your book and about positivity, because I think it's important that we live in such an exciting time and for modern medicine, ideally. And that's the point that I think we're all making, which is that we have this incredible opportunity. We have all these brilliant scientific minds. We have all these resources. We have the power to really create an entire paradigm shift, not only in the way care is delivered, but in the way we run our economy in terms of like getting off fossil fuels. And yet all of this is going to be sort of prevented if we're tied to profit-based models of care. But the positive part, the secondary positive part is, Dr. Farmer, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the joys of being in this fight, because I definitely don't want this to be a dark show, because your life is so inspiring and you've inspired me and I think so many others. Like, what would you tell to a hypothetical young person who's been reading your book since she was a freshman in high school? Like, what would you tell people about getting involved and staying involved? Because you've been doing this your whole life.
Can I start with an anecdote?
Yes, I'd love it.
I was in Austin, Texas, at the university, and, you know, giving a talk in front of the very people. They weren't freshmen, but they were students, many of them. Some were they were largely undergraduates, probably. And one young man came up to me and he shook my hand and said, "Oh, you're Paul Farmer." And I went, "Yeah." And I thought he was going to say something really nice. And he said, I thought you'd be a grumpy old man." And I went, "Oh, well, that's a lovely opening gambit. Why exactly?" And he said, "Because I've read your books." So I think that's, as I was saying to you earlier, I worry that you have to capture the joy of the work. And what I would say to a young person, whether they were interested in medicine or nursing or management or any other or basic science research that would lead to kind of the discoveries that Alex is talking about, I would say, there's nothing more enjoyable than this work. And one reason is because it always succeeds. Like we have a lot to be angry about, as you said. We have a lot to grieve. And certainly it feels that way right now as we head into this dark winter, right? But when you apply yourself, not as an individual necessarily, but as part of a group, to a problem like the ones we're discussing today, and you stick with it, you always succeed, And what can be better than that? If I go back to Sierra Leone tomorrow and to some of the places described in pretty grim terms in that book, I would see massive improvement because, yes, we did reopen the hospital. Yes, we did rebuild it. Yes, we are building a center of maternal excellence or, women's health. Yes, we did see our patients who survived join our workforce. So, I mean, what could be better than that? It's some of the stuff that you see is tough, right? And that's also very much present in that book. But the overall course of events, if you stick with something and work with others, particularly those most affected by the problem at hand, then you're going to make progress. That's something I'd say.
I think it's a pretty good answer. And it's probably better than arguing with people on the internet, as you pointed out earlier.
It's like, I even have a canned answer when my students bring that up. I say, never spend more than 12.4% of your time arguing.
I love that.
I mean, how can you serve if you're arguing? How can you?
But it's so tempting.
It is tempting. It's very tempting.
So don't do that.
I have I think my penultimate question here is,
didn't we just get started?
I know.
Yes. I'm here for hours. What are you guys doing?
I'm giving Jocelyn a lot of the time at the end. But I'm really interested in this. I don't know if you can answer it or if it's more like, so when I went to grad school and got my master's in policy, it was master's in public policy and with a focus on public health. So I actually spent time between the two schools and at GW. And I recommend everybody who's interested in things to look into degrees and learning in both public health and public policy. We need really good people in both of them. In the public health school, one of my classes was literally on pandemics. Like we studied pandemics and pandemic response. And I took an elective on multilateral responses. I went to the WHO and WIPO and all of those multilateral institutions. And it was a really fascinating stuff. I loved that. And I actually did my thesis on avian influenza. And there's this thing that just kept happening, which is it was really accurately predicted what we're going through now, but with one big reversal, which is the US, the CDC, the NIH, and all of the US apparatus was always going to be leading the response. It was always going to be like Atlanta and the CDC. And then it would be like, but what we're going to have to face around the world is leaders who deny the science, right? And it literally would absolutely accurately describe what is the US response now. But in all of the work, it was always somebody else, right? The US was going to lead. The multilaterals relied on the US leading. It's written into the work that this US cannot actually fail. There's no scenario where that happens. That's the reality. The US has failed. And so what I want to really ask about is the humility that's necessary for the next step. So if, when Biden takes over and he puts in a plan that actually is driven by science and everything, I do not believe that the US can just jump in and be like, we're back in charge, folks, right? After such an abject failure, when so-called poor countries, are doing way better in their public health responses than the U.S. I want to see what you think about that.
Well, there's two things I want to say, and one is general and one is kind of specific. As a general point, this will remind many, I imagine, of the debates around Jim Crow. Could the United States credibly lead on any multilateral kind of endeavor with the circumstances of Black Americans being what they were, and we still haven't dismantled Jim Crow, right? So we failed before, I think never so spectacularly on a global public health level. But this, American exceptionalism is often a very bad idea when you're talking about public health and social inequalities. I mean, it's hard to argue that we're not a failure in both those arenas. And as you point out, getting in a better administration that is not science denying and anti-public health investment is not going to fix that magically, right? And the second point that I wanted to make is, Rwanda, which reached rock bottom, I mean, the bottom level of hell in 1994, has come back, especially over the last 15 years or so, and especially if you look at pragmatic solidarity and healthcare delivery. It's really the only place that I've spent much time during the COVID pandemic because of travel restrictions. But they are really doing a very good job. There are very few cases, and their case fatality rate is lower, much, much lower. And it's not some, the age distribution or some of these other ways of conveniently explaining away, African success or American failure. A lot of it has to do with a more intimate understanding of the threats. So, for example, Rwanda had just, confronted an Ebola threat on its western flank. And that those vaccines that I mentioned in the book, which were developed in West Africa, Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberia, were available on that border with the Congo and inside the Congo. And were used to good effect. There were contact tracers everywhere. When the Biden administration, when the early iterations of the transition team and others were talking about massive numbers of contact tracers, that is, people who could figure out who was exposed to whom and how they might be protected, the numbers being bandied about were way too small. 100,000 new contact tracers, that's nothing. Rwanda has probably 100,000 contact tracers, and they're a country of 11 or 12 million people. So we have a lot we can learn also from elsewhere in the world. Obviously, there are parts of Asia, South Korea, etc., where they've just done, China for that matter, a better job, in different circumstances and contexts, of course. But I do think we have to do a lot of soul searching about how we address these disparities in the middle of a pandemic, knowing that addressing the root causes is going to take more time, but it requires that same kind of vision that you and Jocelyn brought up. We have to act now to build up our social safety nets. This is the time where we could do it. Minimum wage, unemployment insurance, health insurance. The American people in majority have been clamoring for these things or appreciating them and been quite clear, it seems to me. And now is a time where maybe we can get some of this work done.
Well, and, I really think that part of the thing we're going through in this dark night of the soul of the country are things that you've been addressing for so long. And this isn't a time to sensationalize our own story, right? And pretend that the disparities popping up in COVID are new. This is who we are as a country, and it's going to take a lot of moral courage and political creativity. So what, next steps for public health, right? In America, across the world, what can normal people do to shift this paradigm towards a world where billions of people aren't at risk for preventable diseases? Like, what do you tell people who aren't doctors and nurses?
Well, I mean, as Alex pointed out earlier, they are taxpayers, or
allegedly.
Well, yeah, right. Or the underage children of taxpayers. And, some of the things that I would venture out on a limb to discuss with a general lay audience would include the matters we're talking about today. This is our, republic and our lives. And, we need to have greater literacy. For example, I think a lot of quote unquote normal people would be shocked to learn that even with these large stimulus bills and COVID bills, like the one earlier in the epidemic, still did not put money into the public health apparatus. We have starved public health in this country for many, many decades, if not longer, right? And that's, a big part of why we're in such dire straits now. If you compare, again, Rwanda to the United States, and just say, well, what fraction of the public budget, the public treasury, goes into public health and public-based care delivery, right? It's over 20% in Rwanda of the public budget, right? It's the highest on the continent. No wonder they have good results. They're investing what meager resources they have, they're investing in it. The United States is nowhere near that, even though we're pushing 16, 17, maybe 18%, but it's largely, out-of-pocket expenditures, co-pays, private investments. Is not the public treasury. So there's that. We still have not invested as a nation in public health and are paying the consequences. As far as the social disparities, I never give up on trying to explain, as you can see by that stack of books by your side.
Oh yeah, have I even brought that in yet, you guys?
No, I don't think so.
Oh my goodness! All right, are you guys ready?
Somebody got to take a screenshot of that with my mother. You'll just regard that as justice. She'll say, at last.
I mean, you guys, I would not be lying to you on you're a wonderful writer, which by the way is annoying. It's like, where do you find the time to be good at all these things? But anyway, all of these books are very good, and they also explain in a very intuitive way the way all these problems come together. Because you point out, like, tuberculosis doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. HIV does not just pop up out of nowhere. These run along lines of material disparity, which are created by issues of exploitation. And we have to be honest about that.
We have to be honest about it. I mean, I understand why humans, turn away from pain. I understand that entirely, and, and prone to it at times. But turning away from the lessons learned, that's stupid. Mm-hmm. It's just dumb. We can't afford to not learn lessons. And, I don't think we can afford to not learn lessons from Ebola for, the novel coronavirus, even though they're not that similar. They're both RNA viruses, but one's respiratory, one's spread by contact. We can't afford to do that. We really need to learn these lessons. And, we're going to just get stuck again. And, when you talk about the social pathologies, one of the things that happened after I turned in the book was the murder of George Floyd. And, the uplift of these persistent, never interrupted problems, the uplift into the eyes of a much broader public, and the sparking of a movement of solidarity is one of the most uplifting things I've seen.
And it was a big deal. So we were covering Lafayette Square right when Bill Barr fired all that tear gas at all those, like, it's
you, Jocelyn.
Yeah, I take this a little bit personally at this point, honestly. But I mean, you're no stranger to that either. You were in Haiti for the whole, Aristide's a personal friend, right? Like you when people rise up and people say, hey, this is kind of murderous and bad, governments have a funny way of being annoyed by that, which I don't understand. You think people would just be allowed to live their lives and be in peace, but how do you deal with like the hope of these social movements, but the inevitability of the fact that, like in Haiti, like in America, they don't always succeed. Like, how do you carry that complication with you as you do your work?
Well, some of the work, since you asked a personal question, I'll just give a personal answer.
Is that
Um,
okay?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was directed to a person, is all I meant, not inclusive. Um, you know, the first great movement I ever saw was the popular movement in Haiti. I was, it began after the Duvalier regime was overthrown, and it was very, very violent the next 4 years, and then again and again later. But I mean, it was very difficult to be in the thick of that. That's the only time I got sprayed by tear gas and even hit by a canister once, right? And it was, but the movement itself was so inspiring, and that's what I meant to say. I know that it was triggered by my comment about, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Marbury, etc. And interestingly, a very similar set of events sparked the uprising in Haiti, the popular movement in Haiti as well, the killing of unarmed civilians. And then when that was overthrown in a violent military coup, and then again 13 years later, these are dreadfully painful things to watch. And sometimes, if your work allows you to focus on individual patients and their family members, I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful to think about the large scale, as Alex said, the policy issues, the social movement issues, but also to be able to remember that there's always something you can do and always people you can work with, fellow progressives, and just really to make an effort to carry that with you, And then also I have distractions too. I love gardening.
Wait, you're answering a lot of existential questions for
I'm
me.
trying.
So it sounds like stay focused on helping individuals with a mentality of the big picture. This is how we stay sane and do this work for decades. Is that the answer?
That's right. That's
okay.
right. In some of those nerdy books you read, I tried
They're not nerdy. They're wonderful.
If I write about the large scale and the local, that's what I'm talking about, right? The large scale political and economic and social forces that immiserate people, and the local, maybe it's a family, afflicted by illness, or maybe it's an individual patient in ICU that I'm seeing or something. But to be able to shuttle between those different levels of engagement and analysis, is something that's really important, I think, for more and more of us to get involved in. We can't shut out the social pathologies of a broader world, but we also sometimes have to look at, what's right in front of us as well. And I'm lucky that I get to do that in my work, going from, seeing patients to thinking about and I hope acting on some of these larger matters that you brought up earlier.
Well, you say your quote is saying all ologies fail us at some point. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. I mean, I think we have some similar ologies, liberation theology, a certain type of healthcare-based justice and socialism, but we can't get so bogged down on abstractions that we forget the reality that we're here to love each other and we're here to be there for each other in times of crisis, and that it often is not pretty. I mean, whether you work in medicine or not.
I was going to say, sign me up, Jocelyn for president.
My last question is based on the theory of the show, which is that solidarity is actually the solution to literally every problem that we're facing, and that there is a win. It's ongoing, right? So it never ends, but there are little endings or little victories. And I wanted to try to get into that. The pandemic that we're facing right now will end. The fact is there'll be another one after it, but this one will end sometime next year. And I want you to just maybe say, with Rwanda as the example, like, what does that feel like? What is it when something like sort of, or I don't care if it's Rwanda, Sierra Leone, wherever you think when something is like a cataclysmic thing and then people get through it. Because I feel like there's two paths, right? Like I feel like, and we need to ensure that we don't go down the path of turning away from the pain and ignoring the lessons. And we go down the path of solidarity where we say, maybe we should invest more in public health. But can you just sort of say what it feels like and what it might look like when this is over?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Alex. That's very probing. I just want to say that, you know, back to the solidarity issue, it was really in Haiti as much as anywhere that I was reminded that solidarity is nice, but pragmatic solidarity is better because history has already happened. Colonial extraction has already happened. I mean, there's a reason the European Union is the wealthiest bloc of nations on earth. It's because they hauled a lot of that out of their colonies and built their opulent cities and through extractive processes. So history also steers us towards pragmatic solidarity. And if some people want to talk about reparations, as we do, I think that's important too. That's a pragmatic solidarity. And, you know, back to how it feels, you know, one of the things that, again, I'm not sure I ever really shared this in an interview, but another coup that occurred in Haiti, a slow motion coup in the early aughts. I mean, first of all, it was, you know, we had members of our medical team and nursing team kidnapped, 3 of our ambulances stolen, death threats, having to take care of people who were badly injured or wounded and didn't make it because they'd been shot and weren't brought to us early on. That it's a lot, right? And that's one of the reasons, frankly, that I went to Rwanda was, you know, and this is really back to Jocelyn's question too. I mean, it's just very difficult to see people you care about and a movement you care about brutalized in that way. And so, to tell the truth, Rwanda was a bit of a break for me because I knew that, and we ended up, you know, 2 of my kids were born in Rwanda. I mean, we ended up living there for years. Going back to Haiti, of course, and the day job at Harvard, but, you know, that was home base for a long time. And in that decade, the transformations that I saw because of pragmatic solidarity were so profound that you could almost feel them happening on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis, which again was kind of new to me. And when we started running the numbers with a lot of different researchers, you know, on maternal mortality, child mortality, life expectancy at birth, all the things, rates of vaccination, case fatality rate from this disease and that, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria. When we started doing that, we came to understand that these were the sharpest declines in mortality ever documented anywhere at any time in the world. So, you know, what isn't to love about that? And the idea of being part of it, of course, is intoxicating. But, you know, the idea of supporting that effort and that work was, again, another call that needs to be made. And now we have to do that much more in this nation, right? To support work that will address these structural problems. And so the feelings, sorry, Jocelyn.
No, keep going.
So the feelings that I derive from those experiences, whether it's seeing a patient get better or a family get better in the case of Ebola, because it always afflicts families like TB does, right? Seeing new, you know, trees blossom in the clinical desert. I gave the example about the Maternal Center of Excellence in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone has the highest maternal mortality ratio in the world, right? And do you think that's going to be the case in this district where the diamonds come from, in fact, in Eastern Sierra Leone? Do you think that's going to be the case just a few years after launching these programs and building this center? I know it's not going to be the case because, as I said earlier, every time you invest your time and treasure and passion and compassion in addressing problems like these, maternal mortality, premature death of all sorts, it works. So we also have to, you know, like rally ourselves and say, we are going to get this COVID pandemic under control. We are going to fight mistrust in an ethical way, right? Which is by serving. and get the vaccine in people's arms, right? We are going to succeed, but it's going to be tough, right? It's going to require reckoning, but we will succeed. We do not have examples of massive failure of real health and social justice interventions after they're adequately resourced. We need to see them supported.
Well, and, I feel bad. Alex was like, don't do a 20-page doc with every quote from every book. But I do want to say one more thing about your books because it's important. You've written a lot about your work in Africa, specifically in the community-based models that are so intuitive to Rwandan communities and how effective that is. And it's like, I think about this a lot. Like, it's almost like maybe what we need to do is just create that everywhere in ways that extend beyond medicine. And this idea of what you're saying, like, what if instead of being incentivized by individual success or material gain, we were spurred on by this idea of community wellness? I mean, how do you, when you go into somewhere that, and like, you have to start from the ground up, like, is that what keeps you going, knowing it's going to work?
It helps a hell of a lot. It does. Whether it's to stick with specificity clinically, like, for example, I know that I said early in the Ebola epidemic that it was outrageous that 70% of people afflicted were dying, that it should be a lot more like 10%. And that was before we saw that all the white Americans who got it, some of them friends of mine, survived. So 0% mortality in that cohort, right? And, the reason I said that was with any kind of conviction was not only because I believed it was true, but also because we needed to see that success was in view. Because frankly, going through an experience like that and seeing so many people lost, again, not lost because they received excellent care and died anyway, lost because they never received excellent care, right? That is, a brutal experience, even for the clinicians, the nurses, the doctors, to say nothing of, the families, right? And the communities. But when you can be sure that investments in those endeavors are going to make people healthier and communities healthier, you can feel it. In Rwanda, for example, I was just there. I was there in August, and went to some villages where I've been before, smallish towns and villages. And one of the things that struck me is that, first of all, even out in these very rural areas where people are sitting outside in their yards, no cars or anything like that, of course, they're wearing masks, they're maintaining social distancing. They're grumbling about the impact on their day-to-day, maybe they're peasant farmers or maybe they're truck drivers or whatever they are. Of course, it's devastating to have the economy shut down. But one, they knew more than it seemed to me Americans did, that the way out of this was by investing in public health and, having some trust in the health authorities and the leadership of the country that, sensible measures would be pursued aggressively. And that, is another way of saying, I wish we had the level of trust that I saw in Rwanda here in the United States. But they didn't have that only 25 years ago, and probably 20 years ago, and 15. They had to work so hard to build that. But when you see it, you feel it. Back to Alex's comment. When you see it, you feel it. Or you can talk to people, that radical option of just talking to people and ask them, and I heard that again and again in rural Rwanda. It's very tough on us because we can't go to market or we can't send our kids to school, can't go to church. But we believe that the authorities are going to help us turn this around. They didn't mean just the central authorities in the capital city. They meant the local authorities. They meant the district authorities, all the way down the line. And if you can rebuild that kind of trust in such a short amount of time after a devastating series of events, it says something hopeful for the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I can't recommend these books enough. This is, I know that we're kind of at time. One more time. This is the book, Beavers, Feuds, and Diamonds. And there is optimism in there. And I hope that there's been some optimism in this hour because, I feel it pretty strongly.
Good. I do too. I do too.
What else do you want people to know before we close out?
The solidarity message is the way to close out. We're in this together. Even if we're separated, and up in our households or wherever right now, but we're in this together, and we'll get through. And in the course of getting through the pandemic, this is our big chance to make some very important structural changes in this country. And, I was born here and raised here, and I'm grateful for that birthright. But there are some outrageous problems to tackle. And so let's get together and do it.
Sounds good to me.
Me too. So thank you so much, Dr. Paul Farmer, for all of the time that you gave us and everyone watching. And I think just as always, remember, radical, pragmatic solidarity is what will build the better world. And we're going to do it all together. So thank you so much for joining us on Solidarity Live.
Thank you, Alex and Jocelyn.